Doris, send in that kid with the cat comic strip.
I'm right here, Mr. Dingbat.
You draw the strip with the cat and the duck, right?
Cuckoo Cat, that's right, sir.
It's terrible. In fact, it started out terrible and somehow it got worse. How is that possible? Never mind. When was the last time you had a funny idea?
Today, sir, look at the latest installment. Duke the Duck gets his foot stuck in a web woven by Sticky the Spider, and Cuckoo Cat says, well, one good web deserves another. See, because ducks have webbed feet.
I've been to funerals that were funnier than that. Kid, it's 1931. People want new stuff in their funny papers. Here at Dingbat Quality Features, we got the best strips. We got Dr. Cheese, Gooseberry Corners, Petroleum Pete, Little Nasty, Little Carla, Little Stinky, Little Honeybee, Little Muskrat, Little Jimmy, Little Does She Know. We got the adventures of Rebecca Lobo and Bobo the Hobo. We got the Sneeze Brothers. Why do we need you, kid?
Because, Mr. Dingbat, America's going through hard times. Americans need a good laugh, and they need inspiration from a plucky cat with 3 good legs, 1 good eye, and 1 big heart.
I thought it was the duck who had an eye patch.
No, sir, it's Cuckoo Cat. Duke the Duck has a quacking cough. You know, like a hacking cough?
I know what it's like to taste my lasagna lunch 3 hours later because your comic gives me heartburn, kid. I'm putting the cat to sleep.
No, Mr. Dingbat, I'll do anything.
Anything?
Yes, sir.
Okay, the cat has to wear pants. Add a smaller sidekick cat named Little Cuckoo, and in next week's strips, all the animals have to fight Bolshevik pirates. Our readers are very worried about Bolshevik pirates just now. I'll keep you going another 15 weeks.
Thanks, Mr. Dingbat. You won't regret it.
My wife said that as part of our wedding vows. She was wrong. You're wrong. I'm wrong. But what are you gonna do? This is a lousy, stinking business.
It's also the beating heart of America. Newspaper comic strips are what define our national spirit. Just listen to this show and find out. And now, the creator of Rex Ashburn, frontier proctologist, Colin McEnroe.
That one also did not last very many weeks with its syndicate. So we're going to be talking about comic strips today, and which is a favorite topic of mine. You will discover this as we go along. I grew up loving comic strips, and then I worked in the newspaper business for 20 years, and I was one of the guys who loved the comic strips so much. So there's a few things that I have to tell you. First of all, in the second and third segments, you'll hear kind of different voices. You'll hear from the editor at one newspaper who picked all the comic strips and dealt with all the complaints about comic strips and stuff like that. You'll also hear from a guy who still draws a comic strip. That'll be Bill Griffith, who draws, of course, Zippy the Pinhead, and he actually does live in Connecticut. But we're going to begin with the story of what was called the Connecticut School, a group of cartoonists, a surprisingly large and diverse group of cartoonists who lived in Connecticut during the 1950s and 60s and did their work there. All right, now it's time to talk to our premier guest here. Cullen Murphy is editor-at-large of Vanity Fair and the author of many books, including most recently, I'm holding it right in my hand, Cartoon County, My Father and His Friends in the Golden Age of Make-Believe. He's joining us right now to talk about that. Welcome to our show, sir.
Thank you for having me on, Colin. Great to be with you.
So you have a kind of double relationship to the world of comic strips. Your father drew 2 of the most famous and classic ones of their day, and then you eventually became the writer on one of the 2. Maybe we'll get to that in a second. But one of the first things you do for us is to paint this world that existed not too far from where I'm sitting right now in Fairfield County, what you call what people, I guess, called the Connecticut School. Explain what's meant by the Connecticut School when it's applied to cartoonists.
Well, it was a term that was invented by Dick Brown, who drew High and Lois and created Hägar, the horrible, wonderful, wonderful man. And he created it in a slightly joshing mood to refer to the fact that, when he looked around in Fairfield County, there were, maybe 100 or so other cartoonists living there. And this includes, comic strip cartoonists, the people who did Beetle Bailey and Little Orphan Annie and Barnaby and Quincy and Snuffy Smith, and but also people who did gag cartoons for the New Yorker. So there was a large bunch of quasi-bohemian illustrators and cartoonists all in this one place, and they had gravitated there for a bunch of reasons, some of which no longer obtain. One of them was you had to be close to New York City because that's where all the work was. The syndicates were mostly based there. The magazines that did cartoons were base there, you had to be able to get in and out. And another thing was, if you were raising a family, you needed a place where it was, cheap. And back in those days, not the case now by any means, but in the late 40s and 50s, Fairfield County was a pretty good place to live. And then Connecticut had no income tax back then. Mm-hmm. So if you were trying to figure out, well, am I going to live in Westchester or New Jersey or Connecticut, that was another big factor. And so once you had a few of these people moving out into Connecticut, then more began to move out. And by the time I was born and was growing up in the 50s and 60s, there was a very large group there, and it was very close-knit and very sociable and a wonderful group of people to grow up among.
There's so many interesting aspects to all this. And so some cartoonists, particularly earlier in their careers, would work in what was called the bullpen. That was not located in Connecticut. That would be located in the offices of the syndicate. Smoky, messy, not necessarily pleasant environment where up-and-coming cartoonists might be working on other people's work. But the life that you lived, the life that you grew up in, was one where, in fact, it was almost taken for granted that one's father was going to be on the physical home property all day long, right?
Well, that's right. And looking back, I realized that the characteristic that first made me understand that my father was different and the fathers of other people I knew were different who were cartoonists was the fact that they were home all day. And you came home from school, and the first thing you did was you went out to the studio, which in our case was just a separate building behind the house. And I had 7 brothers and sisters, and this was a big magnet for us because studios were a wonderful place. Every cartoonist had a great studio. It was, the smells were wonderful. It was, paint and ink and wood shavings. There were costumes around that you could dress up in if you wanted to, helmets and funny hats and feather boas, all kinds of stuff, and your dad was there, and he generally had time for you. So the sheer physical proximity was a wonderful aspect of childhood, but also just the mindset of these people. In later life, I know plenty of people who are bankers and in advertising and many other professions, and they're wonderful people. But cartoonists were laid back in a very particular way, and they were funny in a particular way, and they had a certain sense of freedom and living one's life the way you want to live it. That was a little bit unusual, and I think that attitude really affected the way us kids in the family grew up and decided to live our lives.
Right. There are just great stories in the book. I mean, some of these, I think of Mort Walker, probably most famous for Beetle Bailey, as maybe this kind of anarchical kind of person, but there's stories about him going grocery shopping, right? That I think you mentioned in the book that when people buy originals, when collectors get originals of some of the cartoon strips from this era, they often find a little grocery shopping list there, right?
Yes. Well, I have strips of my dad's. I have very clear memories. There was an intercom between our house and the studio. And my mother was she was managing things. She was a crack organizer. You had to be if you had 8 kids. And we had this big Victorian house, and that was at the front of the property, and the studio was in the back. And the last thing she wanted to do was to have to run out to the studio every time something came up. So we had an intercom set up. And I'd be sitting out in the studio because I like to be with my dad. I like to draw and just sort of sit with him. And she would buzz, and she would say, when you walk into town, like into Coscob, which is the town where we lived, I need you to get. And then he would write things on the edge of the strip, diapers, Chesterfields, bottle of scotch. But I have strips with these notations on them, and I'm sure that other cartoonists did the exact same thing.
Yeah, there are just great stories there. And you said, the cartoonists have a very specific sense of humor. I love the story about Mort Walker losing track of his wife in a grocery store, a supermarket, and going to the courtesy desk and saying, "In what aisle are wives?"
Yes. I remember Dick Brown, who, Dick was a Ursine character, and he was a little bit sloppy. His shirt would be hanging out, and children loved him because he looked like the kind of, if you looked at him and you thought, that's an adult, it just gave you a different sense of the possibilities of adulthood than the typical one. And I remember once he was over at my parents' house for a cocktail party, and as usual, all the kids in our family were given jobs to do, and my younger brother Finn was passing around trays of cheese and crackers. He was probably like 5. And he came to Dick Brown, and Dick Brown, with his big hands, just took a huge handful of crackers and put them in his jacket pocket. And my brother Finn just looked at him wondering, what are you doing? And Dick, seeing the look in his eye, said to him, "Poverty could be just around the corner."
We're talking to Colin Murphy right now. He has very up-close and personal experiences with the golden age of newspaper cartooning, comic strips in the 1950s and 1960s. There's so many things that I want to ask you about, but I think one thing that fascinates me too is censorship happened in certain ways, and maybe a good way to talk about this is that Big Ben Bolt, one of your father's strips, he was a boxer. Boxers boxed with their shirts off, but Big Ben Bolt had no nipples. Why would that be?
Yes, well, he was not a freak of nature. Right. And leaving aside the question of why men have nipples in the first place, which gets us off into different terrain, but the syndicates all had rules about things that you could and couldn't show. And, some of the rules make perfect sense. You and I would come up with the exact same rules. But some of the rules seem to make no sense at all. For instance, you weren't allowed to show a pair of dirty socks lying on a chair. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know why that was the case. I can't even think of a reason. Showing male nipples was also forbidden. And there are plenty of strips that, require men to appear bare-chested. There's Alley-Oop, there's BC, and then there's, Joe Palooka and Big Ben Bolt, the strip my father did. And I was just I pulled a couple strips out of Big Ben Bolt the other day, and was just looking at them. There were some dramatic fight scenes, and there are no nipples. Mm-hmm. You can put some chest hair on, that's fine, and I still don't know, why that was the case. The other thing you couldn't show was navels.
Right.
And this was a running battle that Mort Walker had with the syndicate, which I think he enjoyed immensely. That there was a character named Miss Buxley, and she sometimes wore a bikini, and so he would draw a navel, and the syndicate would say, no, you can't have a navel. And they would use an X-Acto knife and take the navel off, and when enough of them got collected, they would send them back to Mort. And, this drove him crazy, and so he began gratuitously putting navels in. He would put a crate of navel oranges in the picture for no reason at all, just to be able to put navels in.
Right. And yeah, that's right. So he had extra navel oranges in the strip. And, Miss Buxley's kind of interesting. She's an example of also a way in which the world of cartoons didn't necessarily have to keep pace with the world outside, right? I mean, in a way, Miss Buxley is very typical of a kind of character who began to bother feminists at a certain point. She's highly sexualized. I loved the suppressed Mort Walker script where some man in a bar says, "I want to go where no man has gone before," and Miss Buxley says, "Too late." But, I mean, there's a way in which the world of cartoons was what it was, right? Mort Walker didn't necessarily have to have read the feminine mystique.
No, and although he was a widely read man. He's still alive, and I saw him not long ago. And just as a quick aside, the idea for Trixie, the character in Hi and Lois, who we know what she is thinking because her thoughts are displayed in thought balloons, but she never speaks. The idea for that came from reading Sinclair Lewis and encountering interior dialogue. But you're right about the complicated relationship between what strips can do and say and show and the larger culture. And when you're dealing with a mass medium like a newspaper, that comes very much into play because the standards that you're dealing with are not necessarily cutting-edge standards. Now, to be fair about Miss Buxley, Mort would always say that, well, all right, yes, she is a very attractive woman, but the real point of the jokes about her or in which she's involved is to make fun of and to skewer the other people in the strip, like General Half-Track.
Yes,
and
General Half-Track was notably lecherous, and he obviously is, in many respects, the butt of these jokes.
That's right.
Colin, before we run out of time, we've got to talk about this remarkable thing, which I certainly had not known. Prince Valiant ran in the Hartford Courant when I was growing up. It looked so different from so many other strips. It seemed like a world unto itself. How did it come to pass that you wound up joining your father on the creative staff of Prince Valiant?
The strip is a glorious piece of work. It was created by a master illustrator named Hal Foster, and it first appeared in 1937. And it almost always appeared on a full newspaper page, unlike other pages of comics which might have 3 or 4 different comics on a page. This took up the entire page, and it was illustrated in the in the grand style of a Howard Pyle, and so Hal did it for 30 some years, and then he was getting older. He was in his 70s and decided he wanted to give up the drawing, and he had known my father, and so eventually my father took it over and did it for 35 years. And then there came a point where Hal had decided that he wanted to give up the writing as well. And, I, at that point, was at the beginning of my own career as a writer and editor. I loved working with my father. So I began sending ideas to Hal for stories, and I began sending him scripts. And eventually it just kind of clicked. It made sense for my dad and myself to do it together. But I will always be grateful to Hal for his tutelage, because doing a strip is not straightforward. For a reader, it's easy to get what's happening in the comic strip, whether it's funny or dramatic. But it's actually very hard to get that 1-2 punch of words and pictures. And it took me a while to get the hang of it, and Hal was really extraordinary in the kind of advice that he offered in teaching me how to do it.
There's, we should say that, as you point out, Prince Valiant was published only on Sundays, but there were more lines and more ink in a single panel than in a month of Peanuts. What did the pressure feel like? I mean, I've known a bunch of cartoonists. Gary Trudeau is my freshman counselor in college. They all seem like they're under a tremendous amount of pressure all the time. It's, I think, why he and Bill Waterston and people like that have taken hiatuses.
If you're a reader and you're looking at the funny pages, probably in the back of your mind you're thinking, what a great job. Can there be anything better? But if you look at it from the cartoonist point of view, there are deadlines, and these deadlines are relentless. A daily cartoon by definition is daily, and that means coming up with ideas every single day, and that's hard. And even something like Prince Valiant, which was only once a week, the amount of work that went into it and the amount of research that went into it was extraordinary. It took a long time to create that strip. So cartoonists were always conscious of a deadline. And in the early days, back before there were fax machines or the internet, if you were late, it meant that you actually had to get on the train and bring your original work down to the Syndicate in New York to get it there on time. I had to do this once. I remember when I was around 10 years old. My father was running so far behind. He had to get the strips into the city. He couldn't spare the time just to take the train and hop into Manhattan. So he gave me the strips. He put me on the train. He tied the strips up in brown paper, and then he tied them to me with a string to my belt. And then he had people from the Syndicate waiting at Grand Central Station as I got off the train to take the package from me and put me back on the train to Connecticut.
So we're going to have to stop with that lovely memory. This is a book, really, you spend a lot of time with this book. It is lavishly illustrated, both with comics and Polaroids and stuff like that. If you love this stuff, the way I love this stuff anyway, you've got to check out Cartoon County by Colin Murphy. We're going to take a break right now. We're going to come back with some different kinds of comic strip stories.
Life draws an ugly picture, molding and hardening in me. So I flip to the funny pages, 'cause it helps me sleep. Yeah. Oh, it helps me dream.
So when we started doing the show, or even just talking about doing this show, Jonathan McNichol's the producer, and I said, well, you have to get Henry McNulty. And I explained that Henry McNulty was a writer and editor, worked for the Hartford Courant for more than 173 years, or thereabouts, who was sort of my mentor when I got there. And Henry was always in charge of the comics. No matter what Henry's real job was, he was always in charge of the comics. And he was the person who was trusted to deal with all this. And because I was very interested in comics, in comic strips, and Henry and I would often sit around having these very Socratic conversations about what was going on in various comic strips. So it just seemed insane to try to do this show without bringing Henry back in. So, first of all, welcome to WNPR, Henry McNulty.
Thank you, Colin.
The first question is, are comics really for kids? That's the idea, right? The funny papers. You sit down, you're a kid, and you read the funny papers, or your dad reads you the funny papers.
Well, I don't think that they are for kids only. Kids certainly read them, but let me just give you the Hartford Courant as an example.
Okay.
There are 35 daily strips in the Hartford Courant today.
Yeah.
Of those 35, in 22% of them, the originators of the strips are dead.
Right.
In 8% of them, they're out-and-out reprints of what's been printed before, sometimes years ago, sometimes decades ago. And a lot of the strips are just plain old. And whenever there are comments made about the comics, if there's a problem with the comics or something, it is always adults that make these comments and not kids. So kids can enjoy comics, but I tell you, if you take a look at the average newspaper's comic lineup, it's not for kids.
Oh, I have to talk about these problems with adults. First of all, vis-a-vis Gil Thorpe. I don't know if you remember this, but so one of our other colleagues was a guy named John Sandberg, who had been a very distinguished athlete in his high school years at Windsor High School. And I don't know if he did this with you, but John Sandberg, who was a reporter at the Courant, would come up to me on a regular basis and discuss how he thought Milford High, what is it?
Milford, yes.
Milford High was going to do this year. And he would say, well, they've got Jack Sharkey back from last year, so that they've got a power hitter. And and he would describe all of this and some of the dynamics the way that you would talk about like UConn basketball or something.
Real people.
Real
Right,
people.
right.
And I would look at him and I would go, it sort of does depend on how the person drawing the strip. I mean, it's really not dependent on their talent pool at all. But for John, this was sort of, he was an adult person
Right.
having a specific kind of relationship.
And that's typical of a lot of comic readers.
Here's the other one that I want to bring up, because I think you got a lot of these calls. I only got one of them. So there was this woman. There was this woman who used to call up the Courant, and we called her the breathing lady. And
Yeah,
she would call
the
up,
breathing lady, yes.
And she would have this kind of gasping delivery. And she would be transferred to you if you were sitting unsuspectingly at your desk, trying to do something else. She called up the desk one night, and I think Dan Shea transferred her over to me because he was feeling mischievous. So No, all comics have their specific iconography and their visual tropes. When Andy Capp and his wife used to fight, they would fight physically, and there would be this sort of spinning thing in the air from which at certain points, like almost on the dial of a clock, you could see a fist sticking out or a foot or something like that. And so she said, I just don't understand why these two people are staying married. I mean, there's nothing wrong with getting divorced. And sometimes, but like, what do you say to somebody like that?
Well, you can't say anything to that person. But Andy Capp is an interesting case because that was cleaned up.
Right.
At the beginning of Andy Capp, which is a British import, he smoked
right.
and drank to excess.
Mm-hmm.
The strip is still going now, and he does neither. Nor does he fight with his wife, whose name is Flo, by the way.
So, I mean, did you get calls like that from people
yes.
who just like didn't like something that was happening?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the number one call generator for me was Gary Larson's The Far Side.
Right.
And of all the calls that I got about The Far Side, there's one that he writes about in his book, The Prehistory of the Far Side, which came out a few years ago. And it is a cartoon that shows a woman inside her house, and she has barricaded the pet door, which is labeled Fifi. And Fifi, you can see out the window, is running toward the pet door. And the caption says, "Here, Fifi, come on, faster, Fifi." And you know that Fifi is going to bash her brains out against the door.
Right.
So anyway, the calls just came flooding in, and the letters and everything. All the letters that I got, I copied and sent off to Gary Larson, some of which he reprinted in his book, Prehistory of the Far Side. Here's one. Gary Larson's cartoon made me furious. It was cruel, stupid, and ridiculous, not to mention hideous, idiotic, and sick. In fact, all of Larson's cartoons make me furious. Reader, Connecticut. But that was far from the only complaint I got about stuff that was inappropriate for kids. That was the idea.
Right.
It will corrupt the kids. And it always seemed to me that, especially when it came to adult themes in comics, either kids would get it or they wouldn't get it.
Right.
And if they got it, they were old enough to get it. And if they didn't get it, who cares?
Right. So I want to go through some of what I know to be some of your pet peeves. And
Me? Pet peeves?
Yes, you had pet peeves. So one of them was that at a certain point, and it was usually when the originator of the strip was still drawing the strip, but was basically out of gas, that the strip would simply recycle the same tropes over and over again.
Yes.
So, for example, one of them that used to bother you was that there were these peanut strips that involved Sally wanting Linus to be her sweet baboo and him saying, "I'm not your sweet baboo." And there was really nothing new was really ever added to that formula, yet it was repeated for us,
Yeah.
scores of times, right?
Yep. Colin, on your show years ago, I got into trouble talking about peanuts.
Really?
Yes, because unknown to me, Charles Schultz was ill, was fatally ill. And so I had mentioned that, and I in a current piece too, that the strip had run out of gas and was about, and how can you say this about a dying man? Well, I didn't know he was dying. I just knew he stopped the strip.
Yeah.
You know.
Okay, here's another thing that used to bother both of us. And I will give you an example of a strip, and I hope the person who drew it is not dying right now. But what are the odds? So Jeff McNulty, I think his name was McNulty. He'd been a very successful editorial cartoonist.
Yes.
Single panel editorial cartoons.
Yes.
He launches a strip called Shoe.
Yes.
And Shoe is about a bunch of birds. They're all birds, and they hang around in a bar.
Right.
And the problem, well, you want to say what the problem with the strip
Well,
was?
to begin with, I should tell you, Jeff McNulty died years ago. So you're in trouble right away.
No, it wouldn't make any difference to me.
And it's one of the strips that has outlived its creator.
Oh, really? So are there other people drawing Shoe?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, yeah, for years, for a decade.
Okay.
More than a decade.
Well, should we say what's wrong with it? Do you want me to be one?
Go.
Okay. Well, what was wrong with it? But I happen to know that Henry agrees with me about
Let it
this.
be on you.
Yes. Okay. Was that there weren't multiple perspectives. That a comic strip ultimately is an ensemble piece, and so you want somebody who's lyrical, you want somebody who's cynical, you want somebody who's sad, you want somebody who's happy. You probably want a Charlie Brown, a David Copperfield, this kind of neutral, character like the character of Alex on the series Taxi, right? The Judd Hirsch character. You want somebody who's kind of a moral center to it. And on Shoe, it was just a bunch of really pissed off birds who had the same dark, cynical take about everything. And there wasn't like there weren't any other kinds of birds. They
Right.
were just the same bunch of birds who thought everything was crap.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if you're aware of this website called the Comics Curmudgeon.
I'm not.
I think it's.
I can't believe that neither you nor I is that person. But anyway, go ahead.
by a guy named It's Josh Reeds, JoshReads.com, the Comics Curmudgeon. And every day they look at comics. And one of the things he points out is how often in Shoe the characters in the strip talk about like eating chicken. And he goes, wait a minute, these are birds. Is this a strip about cannibalism or what?
Right.
But he points out little inconsistencies and humorous things. It's really worth, if you're interested in the comics, it's a great website.
I think one of the things that you and I bonded on over early in our friendship was the fact that we both think that Pogo might be the greatest comic strip ever,
Yes.
and possibly even one of the greatest contributions to Western civilization imaginable.
Yes, I'm with you on that.
I mean, it was brilliantly drawn and deeply textual. I mean, like so many things were going on there in terms of the use of language and jokes that were being made and jokes about jokes being made. And it was postmodern that they would occasionally acknowledge they were in a comic strip, or they would light their cigars by striking the match on the corner, on the edge of the frame of the comic strip. And it was sort of the opposite of what we're talking about, too. I mean, nothing prepared you for the next day of Pogo.
Right. Let me circle around to Pogo by going through John Cullen Murphy.
Okay, that's good, yes.
John Cullen Murphy was known for doing two strips, Prince Valiant, which I'm not really sure I would call a comic strip. It was more a graphic novel. It was beautifully done, beautifully drawn,
Right.
beautifully written, very nice, still going. And the other is a strip that ran from 1950 to 1978 called Big Ben Bolt.
Which we did not run that in the Current.
And it not, as far as I know, it did not run in the Hartford Times either. So it was sort of unknown in the Hartford area.
Right.
We certainly didn't run it in the Current. Ben Bolt was a Harvard-educated prize fighter.
Yeah.
I know, right?
Right.
But anyway,
Had a dog named Fifi.
and he would get into all these adventures. It was partly about boxing, but for a time he got injured and couldn't box anymore, so he became a journalist, and then he got involved fighting crime and all this. Well, by 1978...
This is my life. You're talking about my life.
The strip had sort of run its course, and people weren't as interested in boxing anymore, so they decided to end it. So what they did was, in the last part of the last strip, Big Ben Bolt wins the Nobel Peace Prize. And the last strip, if you wanted it to be, and they offered newspapers the choice, would be Ben Bolt accepting the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
Strip ends, hero ends. But that was not the only ending. They offered for newspapers that wanted it, and some took it and some didn't, an unexpected ending, which was that he was involved with all these underworld characters trying to unmask them. And as he is giving his acceptance speech at the Nobel Committee, he is assassinated.
Wow.
He is shot dead, and that's the end of the strip and the end of the story.
Like nobody's ever done that.
Well, I think that's the first time you've really sort of gotten rid of a character like that. I can't think of
It would be great if Shoe ended that way.
But giving
All the birds got shot.
giving alternate endings and giving alternate scenarios is not unknown. And now we move to Pogo. When Walt Kelly, who by the way was a Connecticut
Right,
person,
Bridgeport.
well, yeah, lived in Bridgeport a long time, and then when he was an adult, lived in Darien for a while. But anyway, when he got very political and newspapers began to say, I'm not sure we want to run this one, he would provide other strips, which I think he called bunny rabbit strips. They were non-controversial, they were funny, but they had nothing to do with politics.
Yeah.
So that sort of got him off the hook, and he was able to keep the newspapers, keep his strip in the newspapers without them saying, I think we want to get rid of you.
Right. I also recall that you spent a certain amount of time just looking at other strips that were being submitted. The syndicates basically would say, okay, well, we got this new thing.
Oh, yeah.
Lee Salem or somebody would call you up from Universal Press and say, take a look at this. How did you decide? Did you just know right away whether something was good?
Well, the problem is, even if you knew it was good, there's no room for it.
Right, you have to kill something.
Right, you'd have to kill something.
Kill Miss Peach.
Right, and to kill something, it was, well, when Mike Davies came to the Courant.
He actually did kill Miss Peach. Literally, he killed Miss Peach.
To be the editor-in-chief. After he'd been there a little while, like a month or so, I don't know if you remember this, he had a discussion with the staff. One of the questions that they asked him, one of the first questions, what have you learned in your years as an editor in Kansas City? Number one thing he said was, don't mess with the comics.
Right.
He didn't use the word mess. He used a rather more vulgar word, but that was the point. Don't mess with the comics. And to get a new comic in, you can either expand the space in your newspaper and have more comics, which is expensive, or you can shrink the size of the comics you have, which is crazy, or you can get rid of one. And all of those are so problematic that it is very, very difficult for a new cartoonist to get his or her work in the paper. And that's why papers like The Courant have comic strips that are 60, 88, 70 years old. They just can't get rid of them.
But I think we did take either Miss Peach or Mama. They're both by Mel Lazarus,
Yes.
right? Okay. Didn't we move one of them into the classified ads or so? There was one thing where we were trying to create some space and we moved one of them away from the other comics and floated it over in the classified.
Yeah, I don't think it was Miss Peach. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
There were
people
some
got really mad about that too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Henry McNulty, first of all, I feel like we're just sitting around the Hartford Courant newsroom in 1976 talking about comic strips, which is, in fact, what we did do. But it is great to have you back here. Thanks for joining me.
Well, you're quite welcome, Colin. It's been fun to be here.
So we're going to keep talking about comics for the whole show. When we come back from this break, Bill Griffith, the creator of Zippy the Pinhead, is going to join us for some recollections about his strip and other people's strips, including Prince Valiant.
Zippy, he's a coolin' Cool Whip. Zippy, he's the blasting bean dip. Watch out, yow, 'cause here he comes, a totally modular fellow, the maraschino in jello. Zippy, what a baby boomer. Zippy, he's a real consumer. If the rinse cycle of sorrow is spoiling your day, there's a polka dotted pinhead heading your way. Yow. Zippy, Zippy, he put the whiz in the cheese. His life's a patio of fun. A hot as
Today's show is produced by Hi and Lois's next-door neighbor, Punchy McPants, and me, Chion Wolf. Amanda Fish lives in apartment 3G, and the part of Bill Curry was played by Hägar the Horrible. And now, back to Colin.
Bill Griffith is the creator and author of the daily comic strip Zippy and so much more besides. All kinds of books, including a graphic novel, which is The Life and Times of Schlitzie the Pinhead. Well, that's the subtitle, right? I've already screwed this thing up, haven't I?
Yeah, the title is Nobody's Fool, and the subtitle is The Life and Times of Schlitzie the Pinhead. He's known to people, if he's known at all, he's known as the Pinhead that you see in several scenes in the movie Freaks, the 1932 Todd Browning movie.
Right. So, you and I have talked so many times, and I was trying to think whether or not, because one of the things that happens in Zippy is that cartoon characters from other comic strips occasionally appear. They make cameos. I feel like I've seen Prince Valiant stride through a Zippy frame, but maybe I'm making that up or hallucinating that.
You did, but it goes way back.
Yeah.
Probably to 80s.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Those decades blur. But
well, we go back to the 80s, so that makes sense. Yeah.
I did a series of strips where you go into a dressing room at King Features, which is the syndicate that syndicates Zippy and dozens of other comics.
Yeah.
And you go into the dressing room, and there are all the cartoon characters getting into their makeup. So Popeye is putting on his Popeye mask and his funny arms, and Prince Valiant is putting on his hair, and Zippy just talks to them. I can't remember. That's as much as I can remember about that one.
Well, it makes me feel good that anyway I didn't hallucinate that whole thing, that I actually did see it.
Didn't.
Well, we should talk a little bit about, before we started this conversation officially, we were talking about Connecticut cartoonists. We started talking about Ernie Bushmiller, who famously drew Nancy. I have my own thoughts about Nancy, but I want to hear what yours are.
Well, I actually just got a copy, so I haven't read it yet, but there's a book that was published called How to Read Nancy. And it's it's all about one comic strip.
Yeah.
It's an entire book about deconstructing one Nancy strip.
Right.
Mark Newgarden is the kind of guy behind it, who is a cartoonist himself and has been a Nancy devotee for decades. So I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, Nancy to me is the definition of what comics are. Ernie Bushmiller was the Zen master of comics. He took comics and distilled it to its essence. At the same time, he didn't leave out humor. He didn't leave out playfulness. He didn't leave out a nice surreal edge. Mm-hmm. He would use slapstick very often. His stuff was very visual. You could almost look at the strip without reading the balloons and get what happened. I remember I did a little talk once at the Connecticut National Cartoonist Society a couple of years ago. They asked me to come and give a talk. And after the talk, I just was hanging out with the different people, and one of them was Ernie Bushmiller's neighbor growing up. This was a man in his 60s who had known Bushmiller when he was a teenager, the neighbor. And so I said, gee, I've always wanted to know if you could answer this question. Was Ernie Bushmiller a primitive genius, or was he sophisticated? And the guy, without blinking, said, oh, very sophisticated. I said, you mean he knew that there was a cult around him of Nancy aficionados who took it in a kind of Zen-like way? And he said, oh, yeah, he knew about that. He liked that. He thought that was very nice. He thought that was a compliment. It was kind of, I was kind of sorry to hear it. I thought I would prefer the primitive genius.
It was outsider art.
Yeah. But I think the truth is somewhere in between. He was both almost like a folk artist, and he was also a very sophisticated cartoonist.
Right. I wanted the story to go in a different direction. I feel as though the key to Nancy is the rocks. The rocks are the key to Nancy.
The 3 rocks, yes.
Yeah, those rocks are.
That was my. If you look through Zippy, if you go to the Zippy website and put in the words 3 rocks,
okay,
you will come across dozens of strips in which the 3 rocks are featured.
And I feel like I thought you were going to tell me the neighbor said, those are my rocks. Those are my rocks.
I can tell you, here's another Bushmiller story that addresses the 3 rocks directly.
Okay.
Sometime Bushmiller died, I believe, in 1979. Sometime in the 1980s, there was a PBS documentary on cartoonists interviewing half a dozen daily strip cartoonists. And there's Ernie. And he was interviewed on his front lawn, sitting in a lawn chair. He had the world's neatest lawn. The lawn was perfectly mown. There were hedges that were rounded, that had been sculpted. The house looked like a panel from Nancy. And sure enough, over to the right, there they were, 3 rocks. Yeah. Not perfectly hemispherical, the way he draws them, but there they were, 3 rocks. The interviewer asked him at one point where he gets his ideas. This must have been planned in advance. So Ernie reaches off camera and pulls over a Sears Roebuck catalog. He randomly pages through it and puts his thumb on a spot with his eyes closed. And then he looks at the interviewer and says, there's my strip for today. How much more Zen can you get than that?
All right. Well, we're talking about Connecticut cartoonists with Bill Griffith, who is at times a Connecticut cartoonist. So the other person I have to ask you about is Mort Walker. But I feel like I have to establish something here, which is that I think sometime in the 80s, when you still lived in San Francisco, I was visiting you, and you had just run into Mort Walker at a cartoonist convention, and you told me a story that was very funny. And then the next time I asked you to tell the story on the air, you told a completely different story about meeting Mort Walker.
I did?
Yeah. So now I just feel like maybe you're going to tell me a third story, but you tell any...
Well, I think I know what you mean, but I don't remember there being 2 stories. In 1990 it was.
Yeah, that's when it was, okay.
The National Cartoonist Society met in San Francisco. This is not something I usually go to. I've been to 2 of them in 40 years. And in 1990 it was still the old guard.
Right. Gary
Trudeau was refusing to come. Bill Keane gave a filthy speech laced with curse words. It was like the Raccoon Lodge from The Honeymooners. And so I'm appreciating it. It was fun. It was great. I liked it. I go into the bathroom, and there's Mort Walker, drunk as a skunk. This is before he got sober. And he challenges me to a pissing contest.
Right.
With his junk hanging out.
Right.
And
he said, watch me hit that wall.
Exactly. And, to decline was easy because he didn't remember what he said 2 seconds later. So I said, yeah, it's a nice day. I washed my hands and left. But that was my first encounter with Mort Walker.
But see, just so for your own personal records, the other story, the first story that you told me, and you would just come from this encounter, was that you often used Hi and Lois often speaking from a cloud or something like that to Zippy in your strip. And so you were standing next to Mort making your water, and you were sort of a little uncomfortable because you didn't know how Mort felt about this. It came up somehow, and Mort said, "Oh yeah, I've seen that. Send me one of the originals." And you said yes, and then he said, "And I'll send an original back."
We did. We traded originals.
Yeah. But then what he said was, which one do you want? Which puts you in a very difficult position to summon up a specific High and Lois strip that you would want. And you finally sort of kind of blurted out you wanted one that showed the configuration of Trixie's hair. Trixie's the little baby. And Mort said, "Oh, you want one of the Sunbeam strips."
Right.
Now, I don't know whether this is before or after you guys had the pissing.
Actually, you know what he did? He drew me a Trixie Sunbeam drawing in color.
Yeah.
He didn't send me a strip. He did a drawing just for me.
Well, that's great.
And I've got it to this day, and it's really cool. Although my weirdest and best encounter with the old guard that Mort represents was with Bill Keane, the cartoonist of the Family Circus, when I had Zippy enter a Family Circus reality where he follows the dotted lines around the backyards of suburbia, and I'm 2 or 3 strips into it, and I think, gee, I wonder if I called Bill Keane, would he actually just jam with me on this series rather than me making the whole thing up, and he would actually draw, Billy and Jeffy and the mother and father and write their balloons, and we would do it together. So I called him, and to my shock, he was totally into Zippy. He said he reads it every day in the Phoenix newspaper, and he would be happy to do it, but I would have to write it all, he said. But he did do all the drawings.
Yeah.
And then about 2 or 3 months later, I get a call from him. He says, "Now it's my turn to ask you to enter a Family Circus panel." And so sometime in the mid-'90s, there's a panel of, I don't know, Jeffy, I guess, in bed. His mother is saying goodnight to him, and he's having a dream about Zippy. She says something like, "What are you dreaming about, Jeffy?" And he's dreaming about Zippy the Pinhead, which I drew the thought balloon over his head. So that was tit for tat. That actually is one of the high points of my career, to be in the Family Circus.
Yeah, no, I bow down to you now at some distance.
In some way, he was when he was alive anyway. And even to the degree that his son keeps doing the strip, he is sort of a semi-inheritor of the Nancy tradition.
Right. And so, I mean, I don't want to take up too much more of your time here, but I mean, it seems as though, well, first, one thing that needs to be said here is that, the stories that you're telling right now are stories of Zippy's somewhat postmodern take on a bunch of latent comic strips that are, that have a sort of cornball appeal to them. But there's also, I mean, you couldn't do this. You can't. It's hard to impersonate something that you don't love. You've got to like Bob Hope enough to be able to do a Bob Hope impersonation.
To be a good satirist, you have to love your target,
or
at least feel some sort of affection, if not love.
Right. If you didn't know what was appealing about Family Circus, you couldn't do anything with it.
Yes. I mean, to me, Jerry Lewis is a monster, and I'm fascinated by him both. I love the guy.
Right. And so, I mean, in a way, I think it is fair to say that you do kind of love the whole breadth of this story of comic strips that have run in newspapers, cartoon strips that have run in newspapers for decades and decades and decades and decades.
That's how I learned to read. When I was 5 years old or younger in Brooklyn, I don't quite remember this, but my mother and father have told me I would pick up the Sunday comics and try to read them. And they would encourage me and congratulate me if I was able to read a 2-syllable or 3-syllable word, and that's where it started.
Yeah. Well, Bill Griffith, it's been great to talk to you now.
Likewise.
Okay, that's our show. Thanks to everybody who helped, as well as some of the people who hindered. They play a role too. And thank you for listening. We'll be back tomorrow unless for some reason we don't show up.
All right.